The Laughing Cavalier here, presenting to you another tale of these troubled times. Today, I shall be discussing one of the last major Royalist victories of the First Civil War, the Battle of Lostwithiel. Before I begin, I will recommend Stuart Reid's All the King's Armies, which has an entire chapter devoted to this battle and the subsequent Second Battle of Newbury. Also, the British Civil War Project, which has some really good articles on the Civil War. By 1644, the English Civil War had been raging for over 2 years, and despite great loss of life on both sides, an end to the war seemed distant. The Royalists, however, had a pretty good year in 1643, having taken Bristol and inflicting defeats on the Parliamentarians in the west. At the start of the year, the king had over 10,000 men in the Oxford army under his personal command. To the north, the Marquess of Newcastle had well over 7,000 men in his northern army, with various other smaller armies operating in the West Country, Wales, and under the command of Sir Ralph Hopton, not including the various trained bands and garrison troops the king could call on. Parliament, meanwhile, had its main field army of about 10,000 men under the command of the Earl of Essex, with the rest of the country being divided into various associations, each with its own army. The Northern Association, under Lord Ferdinando Fairfax, had about 4,000 men. The Eastern Association, under the command of the Earl of Manchester, could call on 7,000, and a newly raised Southern Association, commanded by Sir William Waller, could bring several thousand more troops to bear against the Royalists. The opening of 1644 started well for Parliament. In one of the major opening battles of the year, Waller defeated Hopton's forces at Cheriton, leaving the road to Oxford effectively open to attack. Meanwhile, the Covenanters had entered the war on the side of Parliament, and a force of 12,000 Scots combined with Fairfax's army to besiege Newcastle's forces in York. The Royalists had already laid out their strategy for the year. Prince Rupert had devised a plan whereby the Oxford army would set itself up in various garrisons around Oxford, whilst Rupert would personally take a force north to relieve York. Meanwhile, his brother, Prince Maurice, commanding the Cornish foot in the west, would complete the conquest of the West Country, most notably the port of Lyme. Parliament, meanwhile, devised their strategy. With York under siege, they had 3 major field armies they could call on. Manchester was ordered to link up with Essex and drive on Oxford, with Waller marching in from the south. However, things began to go wrong almost immediately. Manchester, fearing that Rupert, who had previously won a stunning victory outside Newark, would attack the east, did not move to support Essex. Essex, meanwhile, was not on very good terms with Waller. However, for now they cooperated, and the Oxford army, having had to send men with Rupert, could do little but fall back and abandon the outlying fortified positions. The king, though, successfully left Oxford with 7,500 men as a distraction, and successfully reached Worcester, making feint towards Abingdon on the way that made Waller briefly fall back. At this point, though, the king's position was precarious. If he took on the combined forces of Essex and Waller in the field, he would be outnumbered at least 2 to 1. Events, however, would turn in the king's favour. Prince Maurice had been besieging the port of Lyme, and Parliament decided to send a relief force. Waller was ordered to march to the relief of Lyme, but instead the Earl of Essex decided to take it upon himself to relieve the city, ignoring all orders from Parliament calling him to return. On the 6th of June 1644, Essex marched with his army. It had recently been reorganised, and his men issued new uniforms, most regiments being in either grey or red uniforms, with his own regiment in orange and Lord Say and Sale's regiment in blue. Sources seem to suggest that by this stage in the war, there was a ratio of 8 musketeers to every 1 pikeman in Essex's army, a drastic change from the 3-1 ratio that was preferred at the start of the war. Lyme was relieved within weeks. However, instead of returning to link up with Waller, Essex decided to continue his own independent operations and marched to relieve Plymouth. By the 23rd of July, Essex was at Tavistock, just north of Plymouth, the Royalists retreating from Plymouth well before Essex arrived. The Earl now made a fateful decision. Just across the River Tamar was the county of Cornwall, a major producer of tin which was providing a lot of funds for the king's army, not to mention men for many of the king's regiments. Lord Robarts, a local parliamentarian magnate, assured the Earl that Cornwall was ready to rise in support of Parliament. Essex agreed and advanced his army into Cornwall, believing that with this attack he could inflict a severe defeat on the king. There was one major problem though, and that was basically the entire plan was completely flawed. Cornwall was one of the most pro-royalist parts of the country, and when Essex arrived in Bodmin 2 days later, there was no sign of a parliamentarian uprising. Quite the contrary, in fact. The local people did their best to resist Essex and his men. The situation was about to get worse though, and would turn what had started as a debacle into a full-blown disaster. Whilst Essex had been marching towards Cornwall, the king had successfully outmanoeuvred Waller, and with neither Essex or Manchester, who had marched north to help Fairfax and the Covenanters, Waller failed to defeat the king at Crupetty Bridge. After that, many of the London trained bands under his command mutinied. The king, meanwhile, had received an incorrect report from the north stating that Rupert had won the Battle of Marston Moor. With Oxford seemingly safe from attack, he marched west, joining forces of Prince Maurice, and was soon right behind Essex. Including Grenville's forces, the king now had nearly 20,000 men he could bring to bear against Essex, who, with his force of barely 10,000, was effectively surrounded. Essex fell back with his army to the Cornish town of Lostwithiel. The plan was to hold in Lostwithiel until the Earl of Warwick could arrive and evacuate the army by sea. However, due to bad weather and the fact that the wind was blowing in an easterly direction, the fleet could not sail and was stuck in Plymouth. Essex therefore dug in. His line hinged on 2 major points, Beacon Hill to the east and Westmoreland Castle to the north. The king meanwhile moved his army slowly and methodically, cutting off all avenues of escape. Since Charles had numbers on his side, he could afford to wait. On the 6th of August he summoned Essex to surrender, but after 5 days of negotiations, Essex eventually refused. The battle proper began on the 11th of August. Unlike most battles in the Civil War, though, this engagement was not a single-pitched battle fought in the day, but rather a series of smaller battles and skirmishes over the course of a few weeks. Sir Richard Grenville led his forces and drove the Parliamentarian cavalry out of Bodmin, and then advanced to secure Resperan Bridge. Meanwhile, the Royalists established strong points along the east bank of the River Fowey. Essex made no attempt to counter this, though, and stayed firmly on the defensive, waiting for relief. As mentioned, Warwick was stuck in port. The only hope of relief Essex had now was from Waller, but his army was not in any shape to march into Cornwall to Essex's relief. In the end, an attempt was made by Lieutenant General John Middleton with the cavalry of the Southern Association to break through to Essex. Much like Manstein's attempt to relieve Stalingrad, though, it was a futile effort. His 2,000 horse were defeated at Bridgewater on the 14th and driven back. On the 21st of August, the Royalists began their main assault. Grenville stormed Westmoreland Castle, facing little opposition from the Parliamentarians who fled before him. Meanwhile, Prince Maurice and Lord Brentford attacked Beacon Hill and various other strongpoints. Much like at Westmoreland Castle, there was little resistance, and by nightfall the Royalists had taken the major part of Essex's line. The Royalists, however, were spread out over a 15-mile long front. A determined assault could perhaps have broken through the Royalist encirclement, but again, Essex did nothing. The Royalists continued to tighten the pocket in the following days. Lieutenant General George Goring and Major General Bassett took St Blaise, preventing the Parliamentarians from using the port at Parr. By the 26th of August, the Parliamentarians were trapped in a narrow pocket 5 miles long and 2 miles wide. Again, though, Essex did not attempt to break out, but instead prepared to fall back even further to the town of Fowey, abandoning Lostwithiel itself. He was still clinging on to hope that the navy would arrive to evacuate him, and the infantry. Since it would not be so easy to evacuate the cavalry, Essex let Lieutenant General William Balfour and the 2,000 horse under his command to make an attempt to break through the encirclement. In the early hours of the 31st of August, whilst a storm raged, Balfour made his escape. He and his men were fired upon by Royalist sentries, but a rearguard of about 100 dragoons successfully halted any pursuing Royalist cavalry. Balfour made it to Plymouth, having lost only 100 men. A few hours after Balfour's escape, Essex began his retreat from Lostwithiel. The Royalists immediately drove back Essex's rearguard and set off after him. To make things worse for Essex, the heavy rain slowed down his army, forcing him to abandon much of the 45 cannon and hundreds of supply wagons, further demoralising his battered army. The battle though between Essex's rearguard and the Royalists was fierce. A Major Edward Brett led a charge of the Queen's troop of the Life Guard, and, when he returned, was knighted by the King on the spot for his bravery. The King spent that night under a hedge with his men, expecting complete victory within a day. Meanwhile, back at Parliamentarian headquarters, a conversation like this was happening.
Don't blame yourself,
Skippin.
We were doomed from the start. Nothing remains now but for the captain to go down with the ship.
Why, that's surprisingly noble of you, sir.
No, it's noble of you.
Skippin.
As of now, you're in command. Congratulations, Captain.
Yup, Essex abandoned his army. With Lord Robarts and a few other officers, they were able to commandeer a fishing boat and sail all the way to Plymouth. Skippon, a tough and competent soldier, wanted to attempt a breakout, but by this point it was too late. On the 2nd of September, he surrendered to the king. Charles was quite merciful to the Parliamentarians, since he did not have the supplies to keep hold of 6,000 Parliamentarian prisoners. Whilst the Roundheads had to give up their weapons, they were allowed to march out with their colours. However, only half of this force would reach the safety of Southampton. As they marched through Lostwithiel, many were set upon by the angry townsfolk, who had seen their town looted by the Parliamentarians, with Royalist soldiers soon joining in the looting. It got so bad that the king was obliged to send an escort for the Parliamentarians as far as Poole. The rain, cold weather, and lack of supplies on the march, though, probably killed many more Parliamentarians than the Royalists. Parliament received word of the debacle on the 7th of September. They decided to lay the blame for the failure on the whole operation, not on Essex, but on Lieutenant General Middleton for failing to relieve him. The House then proceeded to draw up a letter of congratulations to Essex to thank him for his conduct. The only dissenting voice in the House during these proceedings was Sir Arthur Heselrigg, one of the 5 members the king had tried to arrest back in January of 1642, which had sparked the war. When the letter was read out in the Commons, he laughed throughout the whole proceedings. Lostwithiel was a decisive victory for the Royalists, and went some of the way to make up for the crushing defeat Newcastle and Rupert had suffered at Marston Moor. But more importantly, though, this battle, and the subsequent Second Battle of Newbury, illustrated the weakness and disorganisation of Parliament's high command. This would eventually lead to the creation of the new model, and finally give Parliament the upper hand. Thank you for watching. This has been the Laughing Cavalier, wishing you a good day.